Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so I think we can now we start. So first, I would like to have the short introduction about the Professor Gallo. And first of all, I would like to thank you very much for accepting to be here to present to us about unified growth theory. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the location you stay now. And welcome to the ISB seminar. So today is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Oded Gallo. Professor Gallo is the Herbert Goldberger Professor of Economics at the Brown University, and he's one of the world leading scholars on the deep historical roots of economic development and inequality. And he is widely recognized as the father of unified growth theory, a groundbreaking framework that explains the humanity's transition from Malthusian stagnation to modern sustained growth. And his work integrates insight from economics, geography, history, geography, and evolutionary process to shed light on why some society prosper than the other. And his research has appeared regularly in the top 5 journals. And among his influential contributions, his paper joined with Joseph Zaya, Income Distribution and Macroeconomics, published in the Review of Economic Study, was selected as one of 11 most influential papers in the first 60 years of the journal history. And Professor Gallo is currently served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Economic Growth and editor of the Journal of Population Economics, among others. And he's a fellow of the Econometric Society, a foreign member of the European Academy, and the recipient of several honorary doctorates, including from UC Louvain, from the Poznań University and Athens University. And his book, Unified Growth Theory, is widely regarded as a landmark in the study of long-run development. And more recently, his book, The Journey of Humanity, translated into more than 30 languages, including Vietnamese, had brought the idea to the broader audience, exploring the historical factors and mysteries that have shaped the wealth and inequality across nations. So today, Professor Gallo will deliver a lecture on the unified growth theory, root of growth and inequality in the wealth nation. So Oded, thank you very much. And now is the stage for you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to share with you some of the knowledge that I gathered in the course of my career. And as I requested, my lecture today will focus on unified growth theory. So to a large extent, unified growth theory is an attempt to capture the growth process over the entire course of human history. So rather than developing isolated theories for different episodes or different stage of development, developing a theory that will capture the entire growth process over the entire course of human history under the conviction and the empirical motivation that there are lasting impact of deeply rooted historical conditions on both the evolution of technology, population, and human adaptation, and most importantly, on the contemporary growth process and the contemporary level of inequality across societies. So to a large extent, unified growth theory is an attempt to resolve two of the most fundamental mysteries that surrounds the evolutionary process of human societies. What I defined as the mystery of growth, namely the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 2 centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation, and the mystery of inequality, namely the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations, why some countries are rich and others are poor. Well, as you know, over most of human existence, human life was largely nasty, brutish, and short. It was remarkably similar to that of other species on planet Earth. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards was very close to the subsistence level, and living conditions differ insignificantly across time and across space. And then suddenly, over the past 2 centuries, there is a dramatic transformation in living standards within and across societies. Income per capita in the world as a whole has increased 14-fold. Life expectancy has more than doubled, and a great divergence took place in income per capita across the globe. Now, this metamorphosis, or this transformation, is exemplified in the evolution of income per capita in the past 2,000 years. As you can see here, over most of human existence, income per capita is fluctuating very close to the subsistence level. And then, in the course of industrialization, we see this tremendous spike in living condition in which, as I said earlier, income per capita in the world as a whole is increasing 14-fold. But importantly, when this takeoff is taking place, it takes place in different time periods across different regions of the world. Some regions of the world are taking off at the beginning of the 19th century and even earlier, others much more recently, and consequently, since the takeoff is associated with such a dramatic transformation in living standards, a great divergence is emerging in the worlds of nations. Inequality at the beginning of the 19th century is insignificant in the world economy, and inequality in the contemporary period is quite dramatic. So importantly, if we are interested in the understanding of the inequality in the worlds of nations, we're interested in understanding what are the roots of the growth process and the roots of inequality across the globe. Clearly, we need to have a better understanding of this singular point, the point in which societies are drifting apart and are developing fundamentally different than one another. Namely, the inequality as we see it across the globe today is not necessarily based on the evolution of societies within the modern growth regime. It is based on the timing in which they move from stagnation to economic growth. If you wish, this is based predominantly on the extensive margin rather than in the intensive margin of economic growth. So when we think about these two fundamental mysteries, the resolution of these two mysteries require the identification of the forces that permitted societies to transition from stagnation to growth, that led into the differential timing of the transition across the globe and consequently to much of the inequality as we see it today. And it would require the identification of those historical and even prehistorical initial conditions that govern this differential process across the globe. And once we will identify them, we will be in a better position to develop strategies and policies that could mitigate inequality across the globe. So when you consider neoclassical growth theories along the lines of the model of Solow, or models of endogenous growth or exogenous growth, in fact, they do not shed light on the two fundamental mysteries of the growth process. By construction, economies are assumed to operate in the modern growth regime, and consequently, by construction, they do not shed any light about the origin of economic growth and as a result of it, the origin of inequality in the worlds of nations. Second, these theories are predicated under two fundamental assumptions: diminishing returns to physical and human capital, diminishing returns to technological progress, and consequently, the fundamental prediction of these models is a reduction of inequality over time and a process of convergence. And naturally, this has limited implication and limited insights about the mystery of inequality and the divergence that occurred in the world economy in the past 2 centuries. In contrast, unified growth theory is an attempt to develop a theory that captures the growth process in its entirety, and consequently it's well positioned to resolve these two fundamental mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality. So unified growth theory provides a resolution of the mystery of growth. It provides us with a coherent theory about the forces that ultimately permitted societies to transition from stagnation to growth, that allows us to understand how initial conditions that existed in the distant past affected comparative development as we see today. So unified growth theory resolves the mystery of growth. It allows us to understand the origins of economic growth in the past 2 centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation. But in addition, it contributes to the understanding of the mystery of inequality. It allows us to understand why some countries are richer than others and how initial conditions that existed in the distant past are affecting comparative development across the globe. So unified growth theory is a framework that captures the process of development in its entirety. It captures the Malthusian epoch of stagnation, the forces that permitted the takeoff from the Malthusian epoch, the emergence of human capital as a central engine of economic growth in the past few centuries, the onset of the demographic transition that freed the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, the emergence of sustained economic growth, and ultimately the rise in inequality in income per capita across societies. So a single theory that captures these 6 fundamental building blocks that characterizes human existence. Now, when you think about unified growth theory, and you ask yourself, what is the origin of this phase transition, the fundamental transition from stagnation to growth, and the escape from this stable Malthusian trap that characterized most of human history, there are few hypothetical mechanisms that can generate this type of transition. One possibility is to think about a world that is characterized by multiple steady-state equilibria. And then, in this type of a world, we have a Malthusian equilibrium, we have a modern growth equilibrium, and a shock is taking us from one equilibrium to another, from the basin of attraction of the Malthusian equilibrium into the basin of attraction of the modern growth equilibrium. So this could have been a very simple solution for the construction of a phase transition that will capture the transition from stagnation to growth. The difficulty is that, in fact, it is inconsistent with historical evidence about the gradual increase in total factor productivity in the course of industrialization. We cannot view the Industrial Revolution as a shock that moves societies from one equilibrium to another. In fact, the Industrial Revolution appears to be a very gradual process, a very rapid one, but nevertheless a gradual one. So the simplest solution to generate a theory that will capture both the Malthusian epoch and the modern growth regime, namely constructing a model with multiple steady states and shocking the society from one equilibrium to another, is not a viable option given the empirical evidence. So the alternative will be, if it's not a shock, will be a gradual escape from the Malthusian equilibrium. But the Malthusian equilibrium is a stable equilibrium. And as you know from the notion of stability, there is no possibility to escape gradually from a stable equilibrium. It's a contradiction to the mere concept of a stable equilibrium. And as a result of it, this is not a possibility either. So the phase transition that is generated in the course of unified growth theory is based, in fact, on a different apparatus, on different mechanisms. It's basically based on the conviction that the gradual evolution of a latent force that operated in the course of human existence ultimately generated this phase transition. Namely, there is a latent force that is operating in the course of human development. And as you will see, this latent force is very meaningful in the sense that it focuses on the pace of technological progress and the impact of this pace of technological progress and the return to human capital. This latent force is operating in the course of human existence, keeping momentum without having any impact. But ultimately, once it reaches a critical threshold, the dynamical system changes qualitatively. If you wish, in the context of bifurcation theory, there is a bifurcation of equilibria. The Malthusian equilibrium vanishes. The economy gravitates to the modern growth equilibrium, and consequently, a phase transition is being completed despite the fact that the Malthusian equilibrium is in fact stable, and despite the fact that there is no shock that jolts the economy from one position to another. So this phase transition, to a large extent, is similar to a phase transition that we are all familiar with in the context of the transition from liquid to gas. So as you know, when you boil water, initially there is no change in the state of the liquid, in the state of the water, and the water remains liquid up to the point in which a critical temperature is being reached. Once this critical temperature is being reached, we see this dramatic transition from liquid to gas. The same was true in the course of human history. For a long period of time, we see that the pace of technological progress is increasing without having any impact on living standard. But once the pace of technological progress reaches a critical threshold, the demand for human capital is so large so as to induce human capital formation, the onset of the demographic transition to modern economic growth, and this generates the phase transition from stagnation to growth. So during the Malthusian epoch that characterized 99.9% of human existence, there is a fascinating dualism: stagnation along with dynamism. The stagnation is in living standards. Income per capita fluctuated very close to the subsistence level. And life expectancy over this time period fluctuated in a very narrow band in the range of 25 to 40. But at the same time, along with this stagnation in living standard, we see certain dynamism. Dynamism in the context of technological progress, dynamism in the context of population growth, and dynamism in the context of human adaptation. And it is this dynamism over 300,000-year period that ultimately brings about the transition from stagnation to growth. Namely, these latent forces are operating behind the scene during the Malthusian epoch, gaining momentum, and ultimately, when technological progress reaches a critical threshold, a phase transition is taking place and economies are moving from a state of stagnation to a state of sustained economic growth. Just 1 second. Sorry. So when you think about the wheels of change, the forces that are governing the process of development in the course of human history, there are 3 fundamental wheels of change: the size of the human population, the composition of the human population, and technological progress. In the course of human history, technological progress is contributing to an increase in the scale of the human population, and the human population in turn is contributing to greater technological progress. But nevertheless, despite the fact that technology is advancing in the course of human history, living conditions remain unchanged. But ultimately, in this process of reinforcing interaction between technological progress and population growth, technological change inevitably accelerated beyond the critical threshold. And beyond this critical threshold, the changes in the economic environment were so significant so as to cause human capital to be essential in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. Human capital formation started to take place, but given the fact that parents were too poor to support the education of their children without economizing on other elements in their budget constraint, fertility started to decline so as to allow parents to afford this human capital formation. This reduction in fertility led into the vanishing of the Malthusian equilibrium, freed the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and consequently, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth led into the era of sustained economic growth. So when you think about unified growth theory, and what I was asked to do today is to tell you about the technical aspects of the model and to walk you through the model. So let's talk about the basic structure of the model. So this is an overlapping generations economy. Time evolves discretely from 0 to infinity. At any point in time, there is one good in this economy, one homogeneous good, that is produced by two factors of production. Labor, that is measured in efficiency units, and land, that is fixed over time. So two factors of production. The supply of factors of production is such that land is fixed over time. If you wish, you can view this quantity of land as capturing the surface of planet Earth. So the surface of planet Earth is unchanged. The amount of this surface that we can ultimately cultivate is changing over time. Efficiency unit of labor, on the other hand, evolve endogenously. They are determined by the decisions of household about the number of children and the level of human capital of each child. So, as you will see momentarily, the model will be based on four fundamental elements. It will be based on the Malthusian structure that will allow us to capture the Malthusian epoch of stagnation that lasted over 99% of human existence. The second main element will be the sources of technological progress. Technology will be endogenous, and we will specify how, in fact, technology is evolving over time. Third, the origins of human capital formation. And fourth, the triggers of the demographic transition. So let's take one of these elements at a time. So first, the Malthusian structure. So the underlying assumption will be that people are operating under a subsistence consumption constraint. Namely, unless their caloric intake is above a critical threshold, they will not survive. And therefore, the first element in their decision-making is to assure that their subsistence consumption constraint is satisfied before taking additional decisions. Second, during this Malthusian epoch, endogenously, there will be a positive effect of income on population. So as income per capita will increase, we will see that the scale of the human population increases as well. Third, there will be a fixed factor of production, land, that will generate diminishing returns to labor. And as a result of it, if income increases and consequently the scale of the human population increases, it implies that the fields will be populated with more people, and consequently the average productivity of labor will decline and income per capita will decline as well. And this Malthusian structure will assure that we have typical Malthusian fluctuations in income per capita around a constant level. Okay. Now, if you think about the production is such that output that is produced at time t, y sub t, is governed by two factors of production: efficiency units of labor, that will be denoted by H, and the amount of land, that will be denoted by X. AT, the level of technology, will affect effective resources and will allow us to exploit more from the land that is present in these societies. So it's a Cobb-Douglas production function that combines efficiency units of labor and land so as to generate output. Output per worker as a result of it, output per worker at time t, that is by definition YT divided by LT, is going to be affected by two elements: efficiency units per worker, how educated each person is, and effective resources per person, namely how much resources is available for each individual in the production process. Now, the Malthusian structure will be such that if technology is advancing, say for a moment exogenously, if AT increases, then income per capita will increase temporarily above the steady state level. But this will not be long lasting, because in the short run, this increase in income per capita will generate an increase in the scale of the human population. The increase in the scale of the human population will make the field more populated and the land-labor ratio will decline, and ultimately income per capita will revert back to the previous equilibrium position. So technological advancement will not have a long-lasting impact on income per capita. In the short run, it will generate a spike in income per capita, but income per capita will revert back to the previous equilibrium position. So this will be the structure of the Malthusian epoch, and you will see it momentarily in the context of the model itself. Now, what about technological progress? Importantly, in unified growth theory, the only initial condition that we have, the only exogenous force that we have, is few people that are residing on planet Earth, say 300,000 years ago. Everything else is endogenous. Composition of the human population, the size of the human population, technological progress, human capital formation, and economic growth. So what are the sources of technological progress? Population size positively affects technological progress. So if you have a larger size of population, and population will be denoted by L, then technology in the next period will be more advanced. And why is it so? Partly because of the supply of innovations. More people implies more potential innovators. Partly because of the demand for innovations. More people implies greater return to your innovations because there will be more customers to your innovations. Third, more people implies greater diffusion of knowledge in society, and as a result of it, greater technological progress. More people implies greater division of labor, and through the division of labor, better refinement of the technology. And finally, more people implies more trade, and through reverse engineering, positive effect on technological progress. So this is one element that is operating throughout human history. The scale of the human population affects technological progress. A second important element is the quality of the human population, E sub t. Human capital positively affects technological progress. Educated individuals have a comparative advantage in adopting and advancing new technologies. So if you think about the rate of technological progress between time t and time t plus 1, denoted by gt plus 1, it is going to be a function, as I said, of two elements: the average quality of the population, or the average level of education, ET, and the population size. And it will take the very simple structure that education has a positive and diminishing effects on technological progress. The scale of the society has a positive and diminishing effect on technological progress. But importantly, even if the level of education in society is zero, there will be some technological progress. Namely, as long as people are around, whether they are well equipped in terms of education or otherwise, some technological progress will take place. And this is naturally what we see in the course of human history. If you think about societies that operated, say, in Africa 300,000 years ago, and these societies, regardless of the lack of formal education, was innovating, not at the pace that we see today, but innovating nevertheless. So the underlying assumption is that if you look at the rate of technological progress and how it is affected by the average quality of the population, the higher is the average quality of the population, the higher will be technological progress. But importantly, even if the average quality of the population is zero, there will be some technological progress. Humans have the potential to innovate regardless of the level of education. So the vertical intercept is positive. Now, in addition, as the scale of the human population increases from low level to high level, technological progress will be higher than otherwise because, again, we have more people, more innovators, more demand for innovations, etc. So this is the structure of technological progress. What about the origins of human capital formation? Well, the underlying assumption here is that the increase in the rate of technological progress increases the demand for human capital because human capital permits individuals to cope better with a changing technological environment. So we start in the Malthusian environment. The Malthusian environment is such that technology determines the scale of the population. As technology advances, more people are being supported. More people that are being supported implies more rapid rate of technological progress. And as I said, in this process of interaction between population and technology, technological progress will accelerate over time. And as technology is evolving more and more rapidly, in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment, individuals must start to invest in the human capital of their children. So human capital is critical in order to cope with a rapidly changing technological environment. So if you think about effective human capital of an individual that joined the labor force at time t+1, denoted by h sub t+1, it is going to be a function of two fundamental elements. The first one, the level of education that the individual receives from the parent, namely the amount of time that parents devoted to the education of this child, et+1, and the rate of technological progress during the time period in which, between the time that this child was educated and the time in which the individual will join the labor force. So what is the idea here? Very simple. Human capital, effective human capital, is increasing in decreasing rate in the parental investment in the education of the child. The parent invested in you more, then you will have more human capital, but the increments will diminish. But at the same time, if during the process, between your education process and the time that you join the labor force, technological progress becomes more rapid, some of your human capital is subjected to obsolescence. Namely, technological progress will generate certain erosion in the amount of human capital that you have. But the most important assumption here is the cross-partial HEG. Namely, that education lessens the obsolescence of human capital in a changing technological environment. And this assumption implies that there is an incentive to invest in education as the rate of technological progress becomes more and more rapid, because it will mitigate the effect of technological progress on obsolescence of human capital and will allow you to be much more productive than otherwise. In addition, there will be an assumption that each individual is born with a basic human capital, namely, even if your human capital is zero, even informal education is zero, then given the technological environment, you have some ability to supply basic human capital. So as you can see, this is capturing the assumptions that we made. If you look at the effective human capital, that the individual with supply time t plus 1, ht plus 1, as a function of the investment, parental investment in the education of this child, even if parental investment is 0, the child will have a basic unit of skill, 1 unit of skill, but the more investment that parents made in the education of their child, the effective human capital will increase. But if in fact technology is evolving and as a result of it human capital is subjected to obsolescence, then the amount of human capital that is embodied in the individual will be lower than otherwise, but in a way that in fact the diminishing part will be lower for those that are more educated. And this would imply, as I said, that education will allow individuals to shield themselves from a rapidly changing technological environment. The last element are the triggers of the demographic transition. So as I said before, in the Malthusian epoch, technology governs the size of the human population. The size of the human population permits faster technological progress. Faster technological progress supports more people, and ultimately the rate of technological progress supports human capital formation. The rise in the demand for human capital induces parents to start to substitute quality for quantity of children. The rise in income, along with the rise in the potential return to human capital, generate two conflicting effects. An income effect: parents will have more children to spend on children, and a substitution effect. But the substitution effect will have two components. On the one hand, the opportunity cost of raising children will increase, and this will offset entirely the income effect. But there is an additional substitution effect, which has to do with the rise in the return to investment in child quality. And this will dominate and will cause parents to start to increase their investment in child quality. So in the early phases of industrialization, as we see historically, the model will suggest that the income effect will dominate. There is moderate demand for human capital. The subsistence constraint becomes gradually less binding, and as a result of it, parents can afford more children of higher quality. And this is what we see, for instance, in England between 1800 and 1870, the time of the demographic transition. More children of higher quality. But in the later part of the second industrialization, what we see is that the substitution effects start to dominate. There is higher demand for human capital, and as a result of it, population growth decline and human capital formation starts to increase. So these are the four fundamental elements that will allow us now to understand the operation of the model as a whole. So if you focus on individuals in this economy, individuals live for two periods. The first period will be defined as childhood, in which individuals are entirely passive economic agents. They simply consume a fraction of their parental time endowment. The required time increases with child quality. So tau will be the time required to raise a child regardless of quality. If you want to have a child, certain time will have to be devoted out of your unit of time. Tau is the fraction that will be needed in order to raise a child without any special qualities. But if you want to raise a child with an education level ET plus 1, then in fact the time that will be needed, or the fraction of your time that will be needed, is tau plus E. This is the time that required to raise a child with education level E. In the second period, individuals are meaningful economic agents. They take a decision how to allocate their time between child rearing and work. And then they take their income and they decide about the optimal mixture of expenditure on consumption quality of children and quality of children. And they consume. So what are the preferences of individuals in this economy? If you look at an individual that is an adult at time t, okay, superscript t, this individual have a utility function that defined over three fundamental components. First, consumption of the individual, Ct. Second, the number of children, Nt. And third, the level of human capital of each child. Now, this utility function may appear very simple, but in fact, as I showed elsewhere, in fact, captures the foundations of the Darwinian thinking about elements that can assure survivability and propagation of individuals over time. So again, the utility function is defined over consumption, the number of children, and the quality of each child. Now, what is the budget constraint? Well, individuals are subjected to a conventional budget constraint. If ZT is their potential income, they will spend their income on consumption and on children. If they have NT children, and tau is the time required to raise a child regardless of quality, and tau plus E is the time required to raise a child with a quality E. So this is the amount of time that will be needed to raise each child. If you have NT of them, this is the aggregate amount of time that will be spent on children, and the opportunity cost associated with raising one child with education ET will be ZT based on your earning capacity times the time that you devote to it. Now ZT, this potential income, is simply income per capita, and as a result of it, you can see how income per capita of each individual is going to be a function of the average quality of the average education in society, the rate of technological progress, and effective resources per person. Importantly, this is not the only budget constraint that individuals are faced. So individuals are faced by a conventional budget constraint, but in addition, as I said before, they're subjected to a subsistence consumption constraint. Namely, they must consume at least C tilde in order to survive. So let me illustrate it geometrically, and it will become significantly clearer. If you think about a consumption set in which you have consumption along the x-axis and the time that you devote to raising children along the y-axis, then there is a subsistence consumption constraint at the level of C tilde. Below C tilde, you cannot operate. You cannot choose to be here because you will perish. But in addition, you're faced by a budget constraint. You have 1 unit of time that you can use to work, and if you work full time, this is the amount of consumption that you will be able to generate. So in principle, you can operate anywhere along this budget constraint. But given the fact that you're faced by two constraints, a budget constraint and a subsistence consumption constraint, the only viable option for you, given these two constraints, is to operate along this green line. This will assure that your budget is sufficient, but at the same time will assure your survivability. If technology is more advanced and as a result of it, your earning capacity is higher, you can convert this unit of time into more consumption. And this will be the relevant part of your budget constraint. And as technology is advancing over time, then the budget constraint will rotate outward, and the relevant part of the budget constraint will be the green line. Now, given the preferences that we specified, if the subsistence consumption constraint is not binding, you will devote precisely a fraction gamma of your time to child rearing. This is coming directly from the preference parameter. Gamma is the weight that you assign to children, and one can show based on optimization that in the absence of subsistence consumption constraint, you will devote a fraction gamma of your time to child rearing, and the rest will be devoted to labor force participation and will generate this level of consumption. But if your income is lower, such that the subsistence consumption constraint is precisely binding, still a fraction gamma will be devoted to child rearing. But if income is even lower than that, then now the subsistence consumption constraint is strictly binding. You will not be able to operate here. I mean, if this will be the only constraint that you will face, you will want to operate here and devote a fraction gamma of your time to child rearing, but this will assure that you will perish, and consequently, in fact, you will operate in this king point. This is the point in which utility will be maximized subject to this two constraint. So this implies that the income expansion path is initially vertical and then horizontal. And this is capturing what happened in the course of human history. As technology is advancing and the budget constraint is lifting, then initially you don't change your consumption, you simply increase the time that you devote to your children, up to the point in which the subsistence consumption constraint is no longer binding. Then you start to devote a constant fraction of your time to child rearing. But constant amount of time to child rearing doesn't imply constant number of children. It's the aggregate time that you devote to quantity and quality. What triggers the change in the budget constraint is technological progress, and this gives you an incentive to invest more in quality, and therefore, despite the fact that you devote the same amount of time to child rearing along this income expansion path, in fact, you devote less and less time to quality, and therefore, from this point onward, the demographic transition is taking place. Fertility declines, and human capital is being formed. Okay, so let's think about the optimization that will occur during the Malthusian epoch. A person that is operating in the Malthusian epoch as a unit of time, this person can convert this unit of time to at most this amount of consumption good. But as I said, this individual is constrained by the subsistence consumption constraint. Now, suppose that this is the income, then the best that this individual can do is to be here. Now, what does it mean? It means that the individual is consuming C tilde, the subsistence, and the amount of time that is left for this individual in the Malthusian steady state equilibrium is precisely tau, namely each individual has precisely an excess amount of time tau that can support one child. Remember, in the Malthusian equilibrium, one parent has one child. This is a Malthusian equilibrium. There is no change in the scale of the human population. So this will be a Malthusian steady state. If technology is stationary, each individual will consume the subsistence level, each individual will have one child, and the scale of the human population is constant. But remember what I said before. If there are people around, innovation will take place. So no one is investing in quality, but nevertheless, innovation will take place. Very rudimentary innovation, but innovation nevertheless. Now, what is the impact of innovation? Innovation is shifting the budget constraint outward. This unit of time can be converted into more consumption good. What is the impact on the decision of individuals? Now, the parent, instead of investing tau in the education of their children, can invest more than tau. Namely, rather than one parent, one child, suddenly a single parent will have perhaps 2 children or 3 children, etc. Now, is this going to be long-lasting? It's not going to be long-lasting because in the next period, the fields will be more crowded, the land-labor ratio will decline, and as a result of it, the budget constraint will revert ultimately to what it existed before the change in technology. You have more technology, and as a result of it, you can produce more out of the land, but there are more people in this land, and as a result of it, the effective resources per person reverts to the previous equilibrium position. So again, people are here, they consume subsistence, and one parent, one child. But again, this is not long-lasting because technology will advance, and again, people will move up, and as people are crowding the field, income per capita in the next periods will revert back to the previous equilibrium position. Over 300,000 year period, we see this rotation of the budget constraint out that permits population to increase and then back, out and back. Ultimately, the size of the human population becomes so large that the increments becomes larger and larger and larger, and in the race between biological reproduction and technological progress, in fact, biological reproduction have the upper hand, and technological progress have the upper hand. People cannot keep up in terms of reproduction with the pace of technological progress. So now, when income is reverting back, it's not reverting back all along because, in fact, as I said, biological reproduction is not catching up. And the process will continue, and ultimately, technological progress will be such that the subsistence consumption constraint will no longer be binding. This will be the point in which, as I said before, the fraction of time that is devoted to children remains unchanged, but the internal composition is shifting in favor of quality, and consequently, a demographic transition is taking place. So this is just looking at it from the viewpoint of the individual. But the individual, as you remember, is optimizing based on consumption, the number of children, and the quality of children. So parents need to decide how much education should we impart to the child. And if you conduct the optimization is quite involved. The solution to this optimization problem will be such that there is an endogenous threshold G hat below which, if technological progress is too slow, you don't invest in the education. The environment is not changing enough so as to justify investment in education. Beyond G hat, you start to invest in education in this fashion. Okay? So as I said, the level of education is subjected to a certain threshold. Below an endogenous threshold G hat, there will be no investment in education. Above it, there will be an investment in education. Now, if you look at the dynamical system is quite involved, and it's based on a sequence of 4 important variables. Effective resources per person. Okay, so this is a combination of technology and land. Average education, technological progress, and the scale of the human population. And naturally, these 4 variables determine the evolution of income per capita. Now, technological progress, straightforwardly, as we assumed, is affected by the average quality of the population and the scale of the human population. So this is one difference equation in which ET and LT is governing GT plus 1. The average quality of the human population in the next period is going to be affected by the rate of technological progress. This was the solution to this optimization. So this is an optimization in which people are choosing quality, and the choice of quality is independent of income, because it is simply based on the return to human capital. So ET plus 1 is a function of GT plus 1, but GT plus 1, as you can see, is a function of ET and LT, so we have another difference equation that maps LT, ET to ET plus 1. Effective resources per person is the level of technology that will exist at time t plus 1 times the amount of land that exists divided by the amount of people. The technology tomorrow is the technology today times 1 plus technological progress. The size of the population tomorrow is the size of the population today times the number of children per each person. And this variable, ATX times LT, is just effective resources in the previous period. So what you can see is that effective resources per person is evolving based on technological progress and population growth. And consequently, it is affected by all the 4 variables that exist in society. And finally, the scale of the human population is affected by the size of the human population yesterday times the number of children of each person, and it is affected by all four variables. So we have a four-dimensional dynamical system that captures the entire process of development. Now, this can be incomprehensible and non-solvable, but in fact, there is a way to solve it analytically. We can focus on what I defined as the conditional dynamical system. We can hold LT for a moment constant, and if we hold LT constant, then this subsystem, the evolution of technology and education, can be solved independently of the rest of the system. I will look at the evolution of technology and education holding the scale of the human population unchanged. So GT plus 1, the rate of technological progress, is going to be affected by the average quality of the population and the scale of the population that will be held constant. ET plus 1 is going to be a function of the rate of technological progress, and this system can be solved quite straightforwardly. So let's first look at the first equation. GT plus 1 is a function of ET. As I said before, the vertical intercept is positive, reflecting the fact that even if the quality of the population is zero, there is some technological progress. Otherwise, it's strictly concave, more education, more technological progress. So this is the first variable, the first equation here. The second one is the solution of the optimization with respect to quality. ET plus 1 is a function of GT plus 1 is such that zero investment will take till G hat, and then there will be positive investment with diminishing increments. So these are the two equations. Now I will take this and I will flip the axis, okay? So it's the same equation that we're, instead of GT plus 1 as a function of ET plus 1, I will write it as, instead of ET plus 1 as a function of GT plus 1, I will write it as GT plus 1 as a function of ET plus 1. So again, if G is below G hat, zero investment in education. If G is above G hat, positive investment in education. And now I can put the two equations in the same phase diagram, in which I have the average quality of the population and technological progress. So technological progress, GT plus 1, is going to be a function of the average quality of the population for a given population size, and the average quality of the population is going to be a function of technological progress. Now, what is the equilibrium here? The equilibrium will be the yellow point here. Why? Because if the average quality of the population is zero, this will be the rate of technological progress. Some technological progress will exist. But since technological progress is below G hat, there is no incentive to invest in education. So in fact, parents will invest zero in education. So this is an equilibrium. No incentive to invest in education, no investment in education, no investment in education, this rate of technological progress. So this is a globally stable equilibrium. If you start, for instance, here with this average quality of population, this average quality of population will be mapped into this technological progress. Under this technological progress, parents will want to invest this amount in the education of their children. But in the next period, this level of education of parents will be mapped into this technological progress. Under this technological progress, parents do not want to invest in the education of their children. They will invest zero, and this will be contracted into this equilibrium. Now, so think about it now in the course of human history. We start with a very small population initially, call it L1. This is the scale of the human population. So this is, if you wish, Homo sapiens in Africa 300,000 years ago. This is L1. This will be the rate of technological progress. But we know that if this is the rate of technological progress, then the budget constraint is shifting outward. If the budget constraint is shifting outward, the scale of the human population will increase because people are moving along the vertical income expansion path. They can have more children. If they have more children, what will happen to L1? L1 will increase. So there will be a shift in L1 and the schedule will be lifted up given the fact that more people implies more innovations. Now the rate of technological progress in the steady state will be at this level. But this implies again that the pace of technological progress and the shift in the budget constraint will occur even more rapidly. This will support larger population, and this will shift, and at a certain point, there will be a point of bifurcation of equilibrium. Suddenly, new equilibria will emerge, and if we wanted to tell the story of a shock in a world with multiple steady states, we will be in a position to say that the economy was here, a shock took it into the basin of attraction of this equilibria, and as a result of it, the world moved from stagnation to growth. But as I said, this is inconsistent with what we see empirically, and as a result of it, we should continue with this process. Here we have an intermediate population. The economy is stuck in the Malthusian equilibrium, zero education, technological progress is positive, but it is entirely counterbalanced by population growth. But nevertheless, with this technological progress, the scale of the human population will continue to increase. Now, from an intermediate level of population to a high level of population. But note what happened in this process. This was an equilibrium. It was a stable equilibrium. This is no longer an equilibrium. Given this rate of technological progress, in fact, parents would like to invest in their education of their children this level. And this level of education will support faster technological progress, that will support higher education, that will support faster technological progress. So once we reach this critical threshold, within a very short period of time, 4, 5, 6 generations, we move from Malthusian stagnation into a sustained economic growth, passing a demographic transition. So to a large extent, over 300,000-year period, humanity is creeping along this vertical axis. Technology is advancing, supporting more people. More people support faster technological progress. And this process ultimately mature at a certain point in which the rate of technological progress is so rapid so as to induce investment in education. Once education is taking place, fertility starts to decline and the world is gravitating into the modern growth regime. I will take about 5 more minutes to complete and then you can ask some questions. So if you look at the simulations of the model, and what you can see here are the 4 variables. Population growth in green, the growth in income per capita in red, the growth in technology in blue, and the level of education in black. So only the black part here is level as opposed to growth. So you start historically with technology that is advancing, say, at a pace of 0.2%. At this point in time, population growth is precisely at the same level. The two are moving together, and as a result of it, income per capita in red is growing at a 0% per year. They're offsetting one another. Technology is advancing at 0.2%, population 2.2%, and income per capita at 0%. Now they're reinforcing one another. Population is growing, technological progress becomes faster, okay? But nevertheless, there is no change in income per capita. There could be some Malthusian fluctuations, but no change in income per capita in the long run. But ultimately, the pace of technological progress is accelerating and causing investment in education. So investment in education is zero up to a certain point. And then when the rate of technological progress becomes so rapid, investment in education becomes positive. At the moment that people start to invest in the education of their children, initially they can afford more children, more quality and more children, but ultimately this cannot be sustained. As a result of it, we see a decline in fertility, and fertility is dropping from, say, about 2% per year into 0% gradually. This freed the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and income per capita is stabilizing in the long run in a steady state with income per capita that grows at around 2% per year. So what are the implications of what I just suggested? What I just suggested is that the Malthusian interaction between technology and population inevitably generate an acceleration in technological progress. We start with a modest human population 300,000 years ago. This modest population is innovating. The initial innovations are very rudimentary, some rudimentary stone tools, but nevertheless, they support larger population. Larger population support even more innovations. More innovations support larger population. And in the course of human history, over 300,000 year period, this process is creeping forward very, very, very slowly. The population growth is very slow. Technological progress is very slow, but it's a process that is gaining momentum. Inevitably, technological progress in this process ultimately accelerates beyond the threshold. Once it crosses this threshold, we see what can be defined as industrial demand for human capital. Namely, the technological environment is changing more rapidly, and in order to cope with the production process, with the demand of the production process, human capital formation becomes essential. But human capital formation is not a free lunch. It requires resources. Parents are living very close to the subsistence. They cannot afford more children, and as a result of it, there is a decline in fertility rates so as to sustain human capital formation. And this human capital formation, decline in fertility rate permits even further technological progress. So the decline in population growth free the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and ultimately three forces: technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth permits the movement into the sustained growth regime. Now, importantly, scale is not the critical element here. First, I showed you one particular part of the model that is focusing on the interaction between the scale of the human population and technological progress. There is an additional component of this model that is based on my work with Omer Moav in the QG, Natural Selection and the Origin of Economic Growth, in which it is human adaptation and natural selection that is bringing about the change independent of scale. But importantly, when you think about comparative development, when you think about the divergence in income per capita across the globe, it is important to note that the variations in the timing of the takeoff across the globe contributed greatly to the inequality as we see it across the globe. And what is the source of these variations? The source of these variations are country-specific characteristics that were determined in the distant past. Geographical characteristics and their impact on culture and institutions, population diversity and its impact on institutions and culture and economic development. So they're unique characteristics for each society that determine the past that each society experienced. Okay? This affected the pace of technological progress, the intensity of human capital formation, and ultimately the growth process. So when you think about each individual country, take country I, yes, technological progress is driven by the average quality of the population and the scale of the population. But it is affected by additional elements. It is affected, for instance, by institutions, by the protection for property rights. You can have a huge population and a huge supply of potential innovators, but if property rights are not protected, innovations will not be as pronounced as otherwise. Or you can think about the stock of knowledge in society. If the society has a limited stock of knowledge, the scale of the population by itself will not generate the same pronounced technological progress. Or you can think about cultural attitude towards knowledge formation and its effects. So broadly speaking, when you think about the interaction between technology and education, technology may be affected by country-specific elements that were determined in the distant past. As I said, geographical elements that made, say, country B more conducive for technological progress than country A. And as a result of it, over time, what we will see that country B will take off much earlier than country A, and there will be a huge divergence in these societies. Initially, these societies are close to one another. They're in the Malthusian epoch, connected to one another, but ultimately, one society will be trapped in the Malthusian trap, another society will be freed in the modern growth regime, and an incredible divergence will occur among them. And the same is true in terms of characteristics that can affect education. Yes, the return to education may be there, but your ability to invest in education depends on the accessibility and the quality of, say, public education. It depends on policy. It can be affected by credit market imperfection and your ability to finance education. It may be affected by cultural characteristics, etc. So again, you can have two societies with the similar G function, namely the same nature of interaction between population and technology, but nevertheless, in one society, the threshold that will be required in order to take off to modern growth is much lower due to the availability of education that will make the return to education higher. So as the process of development is taking place, and this is ultimately shifting up, one society will remain trapped behind, another society will be shifting up. So to conclude, unified growth theory suggests that the transition from stagnation to growth was an inevitable byproduct of the process of development. This inherent Malthusian interaction between population and technology accelerated the pace of technological progress and eventually brought industrial demand for human capital. Human capital formation triggered a demographic transition, enabling economies to convert a larger share of the fruits of fractal accumulation and technological progress into the growth of income per capita, and the variations in the timing of the takeoff across societies contributed to the divergence in income per capita in the past 2 centuries. So to a large extent, unified growth theory uncovers the historical origins of the vast and persistent inequality across societies. It uncovers the forces that trigger the transition of developed societies from stagnation to growth, and as a result of it, it sheds light on the hurdles faced by less developed societies in their attempt to move from stagnation to growth, and it allows us to understand the factors that hinder the convergence across societies, these deep-rooted factors that are affecting economic development and are preventing an instantaneous convergence of the wealth of nations across the globe. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Yes. Thank you a lot. Yes, I really enjoyed every minute of your presentation. So we have some hand raising. Okay, let me call maybe the question from the Vũ Nguyễn from Curtin University. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. And thank you for the amazing presentation, Professor. Really amazed. And I'm sorry if because I'm still a learner, I'm PhD student. So I'm sorry if my question is kind of naive. But I do see like if we just based on this theory, I do see a few implications. Aside from that, so I just want to confirm if that's correct or if there's any, further thought about the models. First is if we follow this model, will there be a time when, the technology level and the demand for education advance so much that the demand for, increasing population is gonna be zero overall and even close to zero or even zero? Will that be um dangerous for the future of society as a whole. Another thing that is quite related to that implication is that there's also a function of death because we cannot live forever. So I was also thinking about like the time we are dedicated to education might increase, but there also will there be any cap for it? Because eventually, since like we cannot raise our children forever, we cannot study forever because we have death. So those are the two implications. And forgive me for my naivety. But if we apply your model, how are we gonna explain those? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is in fact a very good question, and in fact it touches on a very important debate at the moment about declining population and the fate of human societies. So interestingly enough, if you think about the debate that existed in the 1960s and the 1970s, at the time people were concerned about the so-called population boom. And there was a fear that, in fact, humanity and planet Earth cannot sustain the scale of the human population. People felt that 7 or 8 billion people cannot be sustained, and the explosion in population will ultimately lead to mass starvation across the globe. And then in the course of the Green Revolution and other forces of technological progress, it turns out that we can easily sustain the human population as it is at the moment. And now, paradoxically, people are concerned that in fact, potentially we're going to lose some people and we cannot sustain technological progress. That somehow, how can we live in a planet with 1 billion people as opposed to 8 billion people that exist at the moment? So first, theoretically, unified growth theory, as you suggested correctly, is not suggesting necessarily that population growth will asymptote to zero over time. So it's not the case that unified growth theory suggests that in the limit, one person will have one child and population will be stable over time. It is quite possible that what we see at the moment, declining population, will be the pattern that we'll see in the course of human history. And this is certainly relevant in the sense that, yes, it is the rise in the demand for human capital and the aspiration of parents to have a very high quality child as opposed to many of them that is causing fertility to decline, and in this respect is bringing about a massive decline in population growth. In many places, population growth is well below replacement. And in some places, like in China, an actual decline in the scale of the human population. Now, the question is this a danger? So from what you just noticed in the context of my presentation, it is precisely the decline in population growth that freed the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population and permitted humanity to prosper. So is there really a risk? I mean, are we really facing a risk when population is declining? If population will decline, so at the moment from 8 billion people to say within 200-year period to 4 billion people, is this a real danger for planet Earth? So some people will argue that we need people in order to sustain technological progress. But do we really need 4 additional billion people to sustain technological progress in the age of AI? Can't we be assisted in our technological capacity with the machinery that will be developed by AI? My conjecture is that, in fact, technological progress will not come to a halt. If anything, AI will generate a similar phase transition that humanity experienced in the course of the Industrial Revolution, and consequently, we will see a massive boom in technological progress. Population will decline based on the desire of people, but it will, I mean, if we are concerned about asymptote into zero level of population, I suppose that planet Earth will be exploding before because of natural forces, then I would not be overly concerned about the scale of the human population. Yes, we will see a decline, and this is certainly consistent with an equilibrium in unified growth theory, but this decline does not imply that the population will face any catastrophes. Technology can be sustained. Aging population will not be a huge problem because AI will assure that we can assist the aging population in a proper fashion, partly by personalized medicine, partly by other methods. So again, I have limited concern in this respect. I understand the apprehension of people because naturally they do see societies that are aging and they feel that productivity is declining. But I think this is not precise because we know that the younger population has so much more human capital and consequently productivity that the effective dependency ratio is not similar to the actual dependency ratio. So when you count the number of old people to productive people, the number of old people is increasing gradually over time, or this ratio is increasing over time. But when you ask yourself, effective productive people versus old people, the number of effective productive people is in fact, I think, increasing over time. So I would not be overly concerned about it. Now, in terms you ask about the life expectancy and its effect on education. So certainly an increase in life expectancy can have a material effect on investment in education. But alternatively, if in fact life expectancy would come to a halt, I mean, the expansion in life expectancy, which I don't believe that this will be the case. In fact, I think that we will see a massive transformation in effective life expectancy and in life expectancy. But even if life expectancy will come to, the expansion in life expectancy will come to a halt, we will see education stabilizing at a certain point, fertility stabilizing, and we will simply be in a steady state. If life expectancy will expand along with technological progress, then again, there will be more of an incentive to invest in education, and this will impact fertility and will promote further economic growth.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. So I think we have one question from Sang. Sang, can you unmute yourself and ask directly for the question, the technical question I received in the chat box?
Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Oded, for the very interesting presentation. My question is just to understand the theory. So you assume that the labor effective depend on the education and depend on the rate of growth of technology. Okay. So my question is, what is the intention of this setup? And what if we assume that the labor depend on the education and the state of technology, IET?
Again, sorry, I couldn't fully hear you. Are you asking about labor, the size of the labor force? I mean, I could not hear well, sorry.
I think Sang asked you about the assumption on the human capital formation. The function ST plus one, actually you assume at a function of education investment and the chain of technology. And Sang asked you about the economic intuition from this assumption, and he also asked about maybe it should be the function of education investment and the state of technology. Sang, if I interpret your question correctly.
Yes. So, sorry for my connection. That's why
Yeah.
I wrote my question in the chat.
That's perfectly fine. So So the essence of I mean, when we think about human capital formation, the question is, I mean, in the course of human history, we see very little investment in education on a broad scale. We see the elite investing in education, but we do not see popular investment in education. And what I'm trying to capture here is what is in fact the trigger for human capital formation. Why do we see that at a certain point, human capital start to be formed? And the underlying mechanism that is highlighted here is that what ultimately brings about investment in education is a rapid change in the technological environment. So as the technological environment starts to change more and more rapidly, human capital becomes important in order to cope with these changes in the environment. Before, you could simply observe your father and learn how to cope with the changes that occurred in your environment. But now the environment is changing so rapidly, so numeracy and literacy and other elements are important in the production process. Now let's talk about it technically. So how can you capture it technically in a very simple fashion? So what may confuse you here is the following. When I talk about the human capital, this is the human capital that is embodied in the individual. So a person in the first period of life is a child, and as a child, this individual receives certain education from parents or from school, and this is the education that the child receives. So this is what is embodied in this individual, okay? Now, this education is relevant, but naturally how relevant it is depends very much on how rapid the environment change. If the environment did not change, this education will remain intact. But if in fact the environment is changing, there will be certain obsolescence of this human capital in this rapidly changing technological environment. So this is what I mentioned here. So if in fact you receive more education, then the amount of human capital that is embodied in you will be higher than otherwise. But holding the amount of education that you received, if the technology is evolving more rapidly, the amount of education that is embodied in you is subjected to obsolescence, okay? And as a result of it, what is embodied in you is less than what existed before. Now, the confusion part is that this is just one element of your productivity. Your productivity depends on what the human capital is embodied in you, and it's matched with the technology. So your wage will depend on the level of technology times your human capital, not only on your human capital. So when technology is advancing, you're working with more advanced technology, and this will make you more productive. At the same time, what is embodied in you is slightly lower than before. It doesn't imply that you're producing less than before. You're producing throughout more than before, but there is an internal accounting about the human capital that is embodied in you and the human capital that will ultimately allow you to produce. So the human capital that is embodied in you is subjected to obsolescence due to technological progress, but when it meets this technology, you become more effective. So you are more effective, but as I said, some of it is being eroded, and as a result of it, if you invest more in education, you can mitigate this effect, okay? And this is what I mentioned here. When you look at the distance, the drop in human capital, the drop in the effective human capital is larger if in fact your human capital is lower. But I said, this is only one element of your productivity. Your wage is going to depend on the technology and the human capital. So it will never be the case that technological progress is reducing productivity of individuals. Wages will consistently be at least as high as they were before. The only thing that is being generated here is basically the optimization along this line. Just 1 second. Yeah. So when you look at the level of education that a parent would like to give to the child, It will be a function of technological progress. Namely, if technological progress is very slow, and as a result of it, there is very little obsolescence, they will not invest in the education of their children. It will not be profitable. Beyond that, it will be profitable. Okay, so there is no anomaly in the context of how technology affects productivity. Technology is affecting labor productivity positively. It is simply a way of capturing the internal accounting so as to understand why parents are reacting in a particular way when the technological environment is changing more rapidly. Okay?
Yeah, thank you very much for the careful explanation.
My pleasure.
We have a next question from Linh Bui. Please unmute yourself, Linh, and raise the voice, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor. These are very amazing presentations. I follow a lot of your work from, I think, 1996 until now. And I have two questions. So basically, based on my observation, I think the relationship between the technology and population is not like a one-way relationship. It's like reverse causality if we use the language of empirical economists. And what you have shown in here that we have the human capital impacted by technology, but many people, they have argued in the way around. They have seen that because the aging population, low fertility rate, that's why it's increased the technology. So how do you feed their argument into your models? And the second question is related to different types of technology. So recently we have automations and we have also AI, and its impact differently to the human, right? And I think in one of your models from 1996, you have told that you categorize women and men with the broad physical and mental skill. And I think very clearly AI impact differently to the gender aspect. And definitely it will result in fertility rate, for example. So what do you think about the existing of different type and more complicated type of technology and how this impact to the human capitals and also the fertility rate? Thank you.
Thank you. So this is very interesting and it's quite profound. So let me start with the second question that is related to the gender wage gap and how the gender wage gap may be affected by the process of automation. So as you stated correctly in my AER paper in 1996 on the gender wage gap, I'm making the distinction between the comparative advantage of men and women. And the underlying argument is that women have a comparative advantage in mental tasks and men have comparative advantage in physical tasks. Comparative as opposed to absolute. And the argument is that technological progress and mechanization to a large extent is a process that can be defined as female-biased technological progress. Why? Because mechanization, technological progress reduces the reliance on physical labor, increases gradually the reliance on mental labor, and consequently, it gradually decreases the gender wage gap. It increases the return to the labor of input of women more than the men, and consequently, it generates a force that operates towards a decline in fertility. Now, the question is, how should we think about the current process of automation, and particularly AI, in the context of the gender wage gap? And I think it's rather complex. When we think about what is really unique about AI, is that it's not necessarily, unlike earlier waves of technologies that to a large extent were skill bias. Here, the bias is less clear in the sense that automation is not replacing only a physical task. It replaces some mental tasks, and in this respect, it interacts with the gender wage gap in a very peculiar way. So if we reach a stage in which, in fact, physical labor is no longer very important, and now it's all about the degree of complementarity between technology and mental labor, it's not very clear to me how AI will operate here. So certainly at the high end, it will increase the return to mental labor. So for certainly the high end of the ability distribution, this will accentuate what I stated earlier. But at the lower end, it's less clear to me. It could operate in a way that can perhaps maintain the gender wage gap, or even, I mean, not necessarily increase it, because there is nothing fundamental that should cause it to increase. But it's possible that certain type of rudimentary mental tasks will be replaced, and as a result of it, for some women in the distribution, the effect will be very different than what existed before. I think we are in a very early stage where it's very difficult to make a conjecture of how AI will affect different women in the ability distribution. The high end will operate precisely as in my 1996 paper. The low end, probably not, and the medium will probably operate somewhere in between. That's my conjecture at the moment. Now, you asked about the interaction between population and technology. So indeed, so when we think about the sort of the main engine of economic growth, it's truly the reinforcing interaction between the scale of the human population, the quality of the human population, and technological progress, where we understand that technological progress can support more people can support more technological progress, and more adaptable people can support more technological progress. So indeed, we see the causation from the scale into technological progress that is well supported empirically. We see the causation from technology to population that is well supported empirically, okay? But we see this reinforcing interaction that is very important for us. Now, in the context of so how should we expect this to change over time? So what we see in the course of human history, as I said earlier, is that somehow as technology becomes more and more involved, we see greater and greater emphasis on human capital, greater and greater emphasis on elements that can allow us to navigate this stormy environment, and consequently human capital becomes more and more critical. Now, what is the feedback now from human capital into technology in an age in which when we see a change in the composition of the human population, we see more aging population. So as I said before, I think that the conventional wisdom and the way that economists typically look at the problem is not well formulated. Why? Because people are looking at it in a very simple fashion. They basically have the notion of the dependency ratio. They define the fraction of old people to productive people, and then they're being alarmed by the fact that the fraction of older people is increasing over time, suggesting to them that in fact there will be perhaps a decline in productivity because the fraction of the labor force that is actually, or the fraction of the population that is actually working is smaller. But as I said before, think about the quantity-quality trade-off. Think about your grandparents' generation versus yourself. Think about your human capital and your earning capacity relative to them. Probably one young educated person today can support several older individuals, or produce or earn much more than older generations before. And in this respect, despite the change in the composition of the human population, the effective dependency ratio is not changing dramatically. The productivity of the younger generation is larger, sufficient to produce innovation, sufficient to generate overall productivity so as to sustain an aging population over time. That's my view.
Thank you, Professor. A lot of information. Yeah, I need some time to absorb it, but very useful answer. Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
nice, yeah. Thank you. I received one question from Professor Bing. Yeah, Professor Bing, could you please unmute yourself and raise a question?
Thank you, Professor Galor, for your very insightful and beneficial presentation. In your analysis, you consider a closed economy in order to focus on the household decision, which impact on the level of human capital and therefore technology in the country. But we know that a lot of growth has been due to international trade. Technologies and idea can be traded too. So how would your model be able to expand it to incorporate trade without fundamentally changes any of your conclusion?
Well, in fact, it reinforces the conclusion. So I would direct you to an earlier paper of mine that I wrote with Andrew Mountford. It was published in the Review of Economic Studies in 2008, and it is entitled Trading Population for Productivity. And in this setting, I consider precisely what you have in mind, which is a world that consists of countries that differ in their stage of development. So basically, you can think about some advancing economies that are producing at the moment manufacturing goods, and some less developed societies that are specializing in the production of agricultural goods. And I'm allowing these countries to trade, and of course, there are the conventional gains from trade. I mean, the Ricardian gains from trade. So you have an agricultural society that is trading with society that is manufactured based, the society that is industrial based, export industrial goods, the society that is agricultural based exports agricultural goods, and their gains from trade. The interesting part is that the gains from trade are not shared in the same fashion in the two societies. So both society gains from trade, but the gains are converted in a differential way. The agricultural society is producing goods that are not human capital intensive. And as a result of it, by exporting this good, in fact, there is a slowdown in the demand for human capital, a slowdown in the demographic transition, and the gains from trade in a Malthusian fashion are converted into more people. So the gains from trade, but the gains is not in terms of the material well-being of the population, it is in the context of it is mostly in the context of the size of the human population. Whereas industrial societies that are at the moment or at the time are producing goods that are relatively human capital intensive in their production, experience higher demand for human capital, earlier demographic transition, and consequently their gains from trade are used in order to move faster into the modern growth regime, and it increases the well-being of the population as opposed to the size of the human population. So the main insight is that in a unified growth theory, if you have basically north-south trade, the north-south trade will expedite the transition of developed societies into modern growth, will slow down the transition of less advanced societies into modern growth. And what we will see is that there will be a huge divergence in their income per capita on the one hand, and a huge divergence in the size of the human population in the two societies. And in fact, in this particular paper, I focus empirically on the case study of India and the UK, where trade between the two, that is naturally colonial trade, is permitting England to specialize in the production of textile, industrial goods that are more human capital intensive, forcing India to specialize in raw material and agricultural goods. I show how the demand for human capital in the UK is increasing, how the demographic transition is expediting, and I show at the same time how in India the demand for human capital is depressed. There is no change in human capital. The demographic transition is delayed till the end of the 20th century. The scale of the Indian population is increasing dramatically, and the scale of the population of England, on the other hand, is being contained, and there is great divergence in income per capita and great divergence in population. So one can integrate the model into a context of a globalized economy in which you can have even diffusion of technologies across societies, but certainly trade in the conventional sense. And in fact, the results are just reinforced in a very interesting way, allowing us to understand why trade in an interdependent world may accentuate inequality in the world economy. So it's focusing not on the static gains from trade, but on the dynamic gains from trade. So the static gains from trade are such that both countries are benefiting, but if you look at it dynamically, in fact, it causes less developed economies to be trapped for a longer period of time in Malthusian or post-Malthusian stagnation, and permitting developed societies to move more rapidly into the modern growth regime.
Many
Yes,
thanks for
thank you.
sharing your insight.
Yeah, thank you. So we still have two hand raised. Maybe I call Professor Fu or Professor Levan. Fu, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your very insightful and inspiring talk. I have very short question. Just I show the result of your model. It's very, very nice. You show notably the existence of Malthusian growth at the beginning of the economic development. But my question is that can your model predict similar scenario or something very close to a doomsday scenario, for example, but in the future? I mean, such after a certain period of modern growth. So can you model predict that that may have to participate in the debate about climate change today? Thank you.
Right. So yes. So indeed, I mean, when we think about unified growth here, we see this transition from an epoch of Malthusian stagnation that spans nearly 99.9% of human existence to the last 200 years of prosperity. And a meaningful question is to ask whether this 200 years is just a blip in the context of human history, and whether humanity can basically collapse back into the Malthusian regime. So when we think about these 300,000 years of human history, as I said, only 200 years are spent in the modern growth regime. Otherwise, in the Malthusian regime, is it possible that what we see at the moment is basically a passing episode, and in fact, humanity may collapse back into the Malthusian epoch? So theoretically, it is entirely possible, but I don't think that that's, I mean, so in fact, in some of my models, you can see that under certain conditions, you can potentially see reversion. But I mean, but if you think about it in a meaningful fashion, so we reach a stage in which technology is advancing very rapidly. And this advancement in technology is generating incredible investment in human capital and cause population to shrink to a minimum. So how can we think about a reversal of this process? So for this, we will have to have a situation in which technological progress will come to a halt. So one possibility is indeed the scale of the human population is declining, As a result of it, there are not enough potential innovators to sustain technological progress, and technological progress will stop will come to a halt at a certain point, in which case the demand for human capital will start to decline. Then perhaps we'll be less obsessed with fewer children, and this can bring us back into a Malthusian regime. So this is the theoretical scenario that can bring it in. A more viable scenario is a different one. I mean, to think about, suppose that there are different types of people in society, and think about it in the context of, say, ultra-Orthodox communities, or communities that believe in very high fertility, communities that have 10 children, 15 children, that have as many children as they can potentially have. Now, if in fact the situation will be maintained and most people will have one children or no children at all, and these people that have high predisposition towards fertility will maintain this high predisposition, then we can certainly consider a situation in which the world will shift into, I mean, the composition of the human population will, in the limit, will be predominantly those individuals that have high predisposition towards fertility, in which case the world will collapse into a Malthusian regime, because this is their main concern. I mean, they would like to invest as much as possible, but for this, as I said, you need two fundamental assumptions. You need that somehow the dominating society at the moment will shrink asymptotically towards zero, and the changes or the preferences of these ultra-Orthodox communities will be maintained despite the influence of the world around them. If this will be maintained, then yes, in the indefinite future, we can revert into a Malthusian equilibrium. Otherwise, I think it's very unlikely because, as I said before, if anything, I think that in the age of AI, technological progress will become so much more rapid, and quality will be so important because it will determine our adaptability and our ability somehow to face these rapid changes in the technological environment, that if anything, I think that what we will see is even further reinforcement of the mechanism that exists in unified growth theory.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. So we have one more question from Professor Kuang. Yeah, please. Could you please unmute yourself? Yeah, let me.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your presentation. It is really great to have you with us. My question is something maybe not very realistic. In the following sense, we talk about growth, production of good, right? And then now with AI, and then with robot, you can replace human workers by robot workers. And for the whole, maybe the robot workers are more productive than human workers. Then, in this case, about the fertility, so we should say that we don't mind because we will create more and more robots to work for us. But I think that's something, that is my question. The human beings do not need only bread, food, but they need also philosophy, literature, music, knowledge, science. And in this case, what about the robot? You think that in the future we may have two kinds of workers? The robot workers to produce food for human beings, human beings work for science, or for example, science, to create more knowledge. And with more knowledge, they will create more human, sorry, for robot workers and their interaction. There are two kind of beings. Human beings create knowledge, enjoy music and some philosophy, and with the knowledge, human beings create robot workers, and robot workers will produce food good for human beings. And in this case, what would be the story of the population in the future? So that's my question.
Well, so this is naturally a very profound question about the interaction between robots and the human population. And I think that one can only speculate about the nature of this interaction. At the moment, we don't have sufficient knowledge about the way that humans will interact with robots, how these robots will ultimately, I mean, we certainly understand how people like us that were not raised in the age of robots will be affected. I mean, will sort of be complemented by robots, but will not be affected and transformed in terms of our aspiration, taste, etc., by the robots. But can we really conclude, or can we conjecture how our children that will be born in a household where robots will be part of the community, that rather than having natural brothers and sisters, they will have robots. And as a result of it, the nature of their interaction and the nature of the affinity that they need from others will be formed in a very fundamental way, in a very different way fundamentally than the way that we view it. So I think that part of the difficulty here, and I'm very sympathetic to your viewpoint, is that we're looking at it as people that viewed with some suspicion the introduction of robots, that robots will be some sort of add on to our life, but our preferences, our well-being, our aspiration, our cultural consumption was already formed and is well established. And as a result of it, robots can simply complement us without affecting the way that we are evolving over time. But as I said, I believe that the next generation, fortunately or unfortunately, will be formed in a way that will somehow change the way that we view humanity and humans in an irreparable way. In which case, I think it's very difficult even to address your question. We can certainly address your question in the context of how the two of us view robots, but how youngsters that will be born in a household where robots will be the replacements of sisters, brothers, machinery, it's very difficult to consider, and it's very difficult to even imagine whether in fact these individuals will have taste for cultural elements that we view so essential in our life. So I sort of I feel that it's very difficult to conjecture, very difficult. My hunch, and to a large extent my fear, is that in fact these robots will substitute and will affect the way that humans will evolve. It will not be a natural selection in the conventional Darwinian fashion, but it will change the upbringing of people in a way that is irreversible. That's my view.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, yeah. Yeah,
This is just a follow-up. I was just thinking, will there follow up from Professor Goong's and your very interesting hypothesis, which might dangerously be closer to the reality than we think. Being rather young within the generations. Will there ever be and dare I say, one day that is the place for the type of theories like unified complacency theory, where technology got too advanced? I'm just calling it a joke. Unified complacency theory. So complacency is like opposite of growth. Because one day the theory got so advanced, we stop thinking, stop growing.
Right. Well, so you're asking whether, in fact, there is a potential for AI to transform the notion of scarcity. So a lot of our motivation in life is based on scarcity and sort of survival in the presence of scarcity. And the question is whether practically AI can transform this notion of scarcity up to a point in which perhaps complacency will emerge because, in fact, the competitiveness will be at the level of the robots as opposed to at our level. We will be able to be complacent and idle, and nevertheless to enjoy and a growth in our material prosperity that is unimaginable today. It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. And in this respect, as I said before, it can transform entirely what we view as a human, in the sense that our aspiration, our motivation, our drivers in our daily life. It can really create humans that are very difficult for us even to comprehend.
Very true. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, so thank you very much for very nice discussion. Thank you all for engaged discussion with Professor Gallo. So we now the half hour time over. So I think we can close the presentation today probably here because after that we have also the meeting. Once again, thank you, Professor Gallo, for your amazing presentation. I really enjoy and enjoy the beauty of the model. Thank you once again.
My pleasure. My great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Good luck to all of you. And
yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I will contact you by email then.